In the summer of 1988, residents of 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California, became concerned about an unpleasant odor emanating from a boarding house for the elderly and infirm. The stench was not only repulsive to the neighbors, but also attracted swarms of flies, drawn to the smell of death and decay that hung in the air. There were numerous complaints from the neighbors, but the elderly woman in charge of the boarding house, Dorothea Puente, offered various explanations for the smell. She claimed it was the fish emulsion used as fertilizer in her garden, sewage problems, or the decomposition of rats under the house. But a few months later, in November of that year, an eerie discovery was made in Dorothy's backyard that left the entire community speechless. Welcome back to Crime Scene Confidential. In this new documentary, we delve into the chilling case of Dorothea Puente and her infamous House of Death. In 1988, Dorothea Puente was a well-known and beloved neighbor to some of the people who lived nearby. She ran a boarding house for the elderly and disabled, and was known to many of her tenants as a kind, compassionate person, always ready to offer support and care. Few, however, could fathom the dark and twisted nature that lurked beneath her facade of a benevolent Samaritan. Some of her tenants labeled her stingy, and even accused her of withholding their money and mail. Other neighbors remarked on her protectiveness of her lawn, with one reporter claiming she would unleash a torrent of profanity at anyone who dared set foot on it. Little did people know that this woman had a connection to the increasing number of missing persons in the neighborhood, and that her backyard was more of a graveyard than a garden. What events folded to turn this seemingly harmless elderly woman into a serial killer? And what was the fate of her victims? Join us as we uncover the truth. On January 9th, 1929, a girl named Dorothy Helen Gray was born in Redlands, California. She was born into a family of cotton pickers, with a father named Jesse James Gray and a mother named Trudy Mae Yates. Her early years were marked by trauma and hardship, setting the tone for much of her life to come. Her parents worked so hard that they often neglected her for long periods of time, leaving her alone and unfed. In addition, her father, a stern and strong-willed man, battled depression and had a persistent tendency to abuse alcohol, even making several unsuccessful suicide attempts. Her mother also struggled with alcoholism and was involved with prostitution. She had a habit of locking Dorothy and her siblings in a closet with minimal food when she was away from home. These circumstances combined to shape Dorothy's unique character. As the sixth of 7 children, she was forced to scrounge for food in order to survive, an urge that would define the rest of her life. In 1937, when Dorothy was just 8 years old, her father, Jesse, succumbed to tuberculosis. Less than a year later, her mother, Trudy, died in a motorcycle accident, leaving her an orphan before the age of 10. After her mother's death in 1938, Dorothy was placed in an orphanage, where she spent several months enduring further deterioration of her living conditions. It is said that she was abused on several occasions during this time. Shortly thereafter, she was adopted by relatives in Fresno, California, who took her into their home. It was there that one of Dorothy's behavioral problems became apparent. She had a pronounced and exaggerated tendency to lie and make up stories for personal gain. At school, she made up stories about her past, claiming to have been born in Mexico with 18 siblings, only 14 of whom survived. In 1945, at the age of 16, Dorothy married a man named Fred McFall, who had recently returned home from the war. They had 2 daughters. The first child was born in 1946, but Dorothy, feeling unprepared for motherhood, sent her to live with relatives. 2 years later, in 1948, she gave birth to her second daughter, whom she promptly put up for adoption. Her third pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Dorothy never cared for any of her children. Over time, as her propensity for lying became more apparent, and her erratic and explosive behavior continued with no signs of improvement, her husband, who she claimed had experienced extraordinary events such as the Bataan Death March or the bombing of Hiroshima, Japan, left her. This was an extremely devastating blow to her, plunging her into a deep depression that led her to repeat the mistakes of her parents, resorting to excessive drinking and, like her mother, engaging in prostitution to survive. Dorothy never stopped inventing lies. Whenever anyone inquired about her husband, she insisted that he had died of a heart attack. Shortly after her husband left, Dorothy began forging checks, but with little success. She was soon caught and sentenced to a year in prison, but was paroled after serving only 6 months. Shortly after her release, she became pregnant again, this time by a man she barely knew and about whom very little information is available. Once again, her child was given up for adoption. In 1952, she married a man of Swedish descent named Axel Johansson, but this new marriage made no significant change in her life. Taking advantage of her husband's long absences, Dorothy continued to engage in prostitution, which led to heated arguments with her husband. At one point, he even took her to a psychiatrist who diagnosed her as a pathological liar. In the 1960s, Dorothy began to commit more serious crimes. In 1960, she was sentenced to 90 days in jail for running a brothel, and sometime later, she was arrested for vagrancy and living in poverty. She remained in jail for another 90 days. After a complex and tumultuous period in her life, Dorothy began working as a nursing assistant, primarily caring for the elderly, terminally ill, and disabled. It wasn't long before she began administrating illegal pensions for the sick. In 1966, she divorced her second husband to marry a man 19 years her junior named Roberto Puente, and the wedding took place in Mexico City. The relationship proved to be as volatile and complicated as her previous ones. They divorced 2 years later, although Dorothy kept the family name for the rest of her life. After the dissolution of her third marriage, Dorothy moved to Sacramento, the capital of California, where she purchased a 3-story, 16-room house at 2100 F Street. This home became an extremely lucrative venture for Dorothy, as she opened its doors to people in dire circumstances, such as the elderly, the sick, and even the homeless. Although she maintained strict standards, she presented herself as a consummate hostess, willingly welcoming anyone into her home on occasions such as Easter and Christmas. In 1976, Dorothy married for the 4th time, but her new husband, a man named Pedro Montalvo, turned out to be a much worse choice. Montalvo proved to be a violent man with a drinking problem, following in his father's footsteps. Their relationship didn't last more than a few months. The breakup led her to spend nights in bars looking for companionship, preferably with older men whom she would charm with sweet attention and companionship, only to deceive them later. She would forge their signatures and steal as much money as she could. Her scheme to defraud her victims was relatively successful, although she was the subject of numerous complaints. Dorothy Puente was charged with over 34 counts of fraud, found guilty, and spent 2.5 years behind bars. After her release on probation, she continued to commit more crimes. It was during this time that Dorothy Puente took her first life. The victim was Ruth Monroe, a 61-year-old woman who arrived at the boarding house in April of 1982. Puente quickly gained the new tenants' trust and affection. 17 days later, Ruth Monroe was found dead. The cause? An overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. Dorothy told the detectives that Ruth had been deeply saddened and depressed by her husband's illness, and that she had probably decided to end her own life in a moment of deep grief. The detectives accepted Dorothy's statements at face value, and the case was closed. Weeks later, however, Puente found herself back in jail, accused once again of fraud. One of her victims, a man named Malcolm McKenzie, told police that he had met Puente at a bar called the Zebra Club. They had drinks together, and soon after, he invited her to his apartment. Shortly after arriving, McKenzie became extremely dizzy and moments later found himself on the floor, conscious but unable to move. He could only watch as Puente ransacked his entire apartment, taking a collection of rare coins and forcibly removing a diamond ring from his finger. On August 18, 1982, Puente appeared in court where she was convicted of 3 counts of burglary and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Surprisingly, the judge assigned to the case, Judge Roger Warren, refused to consider previous similar charges against her, thus sparing her a much longer sentence. This decision, not surprisingly, may have saved several lives. Puente became very popular in prison, easily fitting in with her fellow inmates, who enjoyed the outrageous and unbelievable fabrications she spun. However, her addiction to falsehoods eventually got her into trouble. On one occasion, she violated an unspoken rule of prison by falsely accusing a guard of orchestrating an assault on another inmate, a lapse in judgment that resulted in a brutal beating. After the attack, she was transferred to protective custody. While in protective custody, Dorothy received a letter that would change the course of her life. The letter was from Everson Gilman, a 77-year-old retired man who had developed a habit of corresponding with incarcerated individuals. Energized by these letters, Dorothy began writing back, and their connection deepened with each exchange. In time, the man fell in love with her, and in September of 1985, upon Dorothy's release, Everson arrived at the prison to pick her up in his 1984 pickup truck. Shortly thereafter, they began a relationship that even sparked rumors of an impending wedding. But less than 2 months later, in November of 1985, Dorothy hired a man named Ismael Flores for a strange and peculiar job. She hired him to install wood paneling in her new apartment at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, a place that she and Everson had paid for jointly using a joint bank account. But the twist was in the form of the payment. In addition to the $800 in cash, Puente also transferred her boyfriend's Ford truck to Ismael, claiming that Everson was out of town and had no need for it. Dorothy then asked Ismael to build a strange wooden box, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, claiming it would serve as storage for books and other items. Ismael agreed to her request and returned the next day to find, to his astonishment, that the lid of the box had been nailed shut. Dorothy then made a final appeal to Ismael Flores. She begged him to help her load the box onto the truck and take it to a warehouse she owned. Silently, Flores agreed, but on the way to the warehouse, Dorothy abruptly changed her plans. She suggested that upon reflection, the box contained nothing but garbage and that it would be best to dump it into a river in Sutter County. This sudden change of heart puzzled Flores, but Dorothy's assurance that the box really did contain garbage dissuaded him from further questions, and he agreed to help her dump it in the river. Nothing unusual happened for some time until January of 1986, when a couple of fishermen stumbled upon a wooden crate in the middle of the river that was emitting an unbearable odor. When the police arrived to examine the box, they discovered the contents of a human body wrapped in a white sheet and bound with black tape. The body was so badly decomposed that, despite the best efforts of investigators, its identity could never be determined. The only slight clue was a wristwatch on the left hand, but this detail yielded no results. For nearly 3 years, Everson Gilman remained missing, with no one daring to speculate on his whereabouts. And so it was that Dorothea Puente would go on to amass an extensive list of victims, while cultivating a reputation as a generous and compassionate woman. Social workers held her in high regard, as Puente had no qualms about taking on the most difficult and troubled cases, including drug addicts, the mentally ill, and other difficult people that most would simply overlook. Little did they know that one by one, the woman was amassing a morbid collection of deaths. On August 19th, Puente's tranquil home was shattered by the mysterious disappearance of Betty Palmer, a 77-year-old woman who never returned home from her doctor's appointment. Several weeks later, Puente produced an identification card in Betty's name. How had Puente obtained Betty's ID, and why did it have Dorothy's picture? But the mystery did not end there. In February of the following year, Leona Carpenter, another 78-year-old tenant, was released from the hospital and placed under Puente's care. At first, she was given a temporary bed on the couch, but 2 weeks later, she disappeared without a trace. The pattern continued. James Gallup, age 62, was last seen in July of 1987 after visiting a doctor who confirmed that he was moving into a boarding house at 1426 F Street. In October of that year, however, 62-year-old Vera Martin moved into the boarding house and was never seen again. The following February, in 1988, Alvaro Bert Montoya arrived at the boarding house, and Puente soon took control of his affairs. But Bert also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. And when the other tenants inquired about him, Puente informed them that he had traveled to Mexico to visit with his family. Alvaro Montoya, also known as El Jefe, held a prominent position in the community, and his sudden disappearance began to cause concern among the residents and the police, especially since Alvaro Montoya had been hired by Dorothea Puente to perform a series of very strange tasks just prior to his disappearance. In exchange for food and shelter, Montoya spent several months in the basement, tirelessly digging and wheelbarrowing debris to a nearby dumpster. Suddenly, he built a small warehouse in the back of the yard and covered it with a layer of concrete. After a few days, the neighbors began to complain about the foul smell and the abundance of flies. The elderly woman always made excuses, claiming it was fish remains or a plumbing problem, but despite spraying her yard with bleach and various air fresheners, the stench remained. Over time, the neighbors became suspicious of the increasing number of disappearances. It was unusual for so many people to enter this house and never come out. Then, on November 7th, Alvaro was reported missing. 4 days later, on November 11, 1988, the police visited Dorothea Puente's house to inquire about Alvaro Montoya, who had been reported missing by social services. Dorothea explained that Montoya had gone to Mexico and that the other people had simply left. When the officers asked to enter the house, she willingly complied. At first, the house seemed innocent and ordinary, just like any other. However, as they were about to leave, the officers noticed signs of disturbed soil in the backyard. Without saying a word, the men left, but soon returned with shovels and picks. They began digging, and soon pieces of cloth began to emerge from the ground. They continued digging, and soon discovered more cloth and what at first appeared to be a tree root, but turned out to be a human bone. Dorothea Puente screamed in horror at the sight. They then unearthed another bone, followed by a shoe with a fragment of a foot still inside. The officers decided to stop the dig. Strangely, the officers did not consider Dorothea as a suspect. They returned the next day with equipment and a team of forensic anthropologists who began exhuming the bodies one by one. The first body found was that of a small gray-haired woman in a skeletal state, identified as Leona Carpenter. Upon learning of this discovery, the coroner ordered the exhumation to continue. While the team was drilling through a concrete slab, Dorothea approached one of the detectives and asked if she was under arrest. When he said no, she asked if she could go to the Clarion Hotel a few blocks away for a cup of coffee, and he let her go. Shortly thereafter, the discovery of 3 bodies under the concrete slab and 2 more in the adjacent yard sent shockwaves through the community. Extensive excavations lasted for several days and eventually revealed that the boarding house had been transformed into a nightmarish graveyard containing more than 7 lifeless bodies. Among the bodies uncovered were Alvaro Bert Montoya, James Gallup, Vera Martin, and Betty Palmer. Their remains, unlike the others, were wrapped in a sleeveless white nightgown and placed under a headless, limbless statue of St. Francis of Assisi. Also found were the remains of Dorothy Miller, a 64-year-old woman who suffered from alcoholism. She was last seen sitting in the front of the boarding house with her arms crossed over her chest. Another body belonged to Benjamin Fink, 55, also an alcoholic, last seen in April of 1988. Forensic tests found significant levels of flurazepam in all 7 bodies. The unexpected and disconcerting sight of the bodies in her apartment caught the serial killer off guard, diverting suspicion from the police. Taking advantage of her ruse to go out for coffee, she created enough space to make her getaway. Alarm bells immediately went off, and police concentrated their efforts on airports, train stations, and bus terminals. Eventually, Dorothy was apprehended in Los Angeles while attempting to ensnare her next victim, a 59-year-old retiree named Charles Wilgus, whom she had met at a bar. In an attempt to evade detection, Dorothy assumed the identity of Donna Johnson, a supposed recent widow. At 10 p.m., Charles Wilgus was in a bar in downtown Los Angeles when he noticed an elegant woman in a red coat sitting next to him. Introducing herself as Donna Johansson, a widowed Sacramento resident grieving the recent loss of her husband, she caught Charles's attention. Sympathetic to her plight after hearing that her luggage had been misplaced by a taxi and her heels were damaged, Charles kindly offered to take her shoes to a nearby cobbler to have them fixed. Upon his return, Donna asked an unusual question, inquiring as to the amount of Charles's monthly Social Security income. Finding the question rather odd, Charles decided not to dwell on it. When Donna suggested that they live together, claiming that they were both lonely souls who could keep each other company, Charles agreed. But when they arrived at his apartment, Charles turned on the television and stumbled upon a shocking revelation. The woman he had spent the day with was wanted by the police on suspicion of murder. Without hesitation, he contacted a local television station to verify the news. Once confirmed, reporter Gene Silver quickly arranged for camera crew and police to converge on the hotel where the woman was staying. When Dorothy opened the door, she was immediately stopped when her driver's license was recognized. She was escorted to the airport for her return flight to Sacramento, and upon arrival, was held without bail on a murder charge. After a lengthy trial that began in 1982 and included more than 150 witnesses and 3,500 pages of incriminating evidence against her, prosecutor John O'Mara sought the death penalty. However, Dorothy was eventually sentenced to life in prison for 3 of the 7 murders, as the trial for the remaining cases ended in mistrial. Upon hearing the verdict, Dorothy simply smiled at her lawyers and declared, "I didn't kill anyone," and maintained her innocence until March 27, 2011, when she died of natural causes in Chowchilla, a well-known California prison. Dorothy has become a central figure in numerous television series, and the boarding house that once served as her home has been transformed into a museum where thousands of people from around the world revisit the myth of the infamous House of Death each year. If you enjoyed this content, remember to like and subscribe to stay updated on more cases like this in the future. See you in the next case.
So, man,
All right, guys, come on. Back up. Let's give him room, huh? Let's get him out of here.
Mr. Monroe, what can you tell us about the murders? Are you involved in any way?
Excuse me.
Max, take him out over here.
Do you know why you've been arrested, ma'am?
Right.
Right now into the compound. Dorothea!
You're gonna go with that?
Dorothea, did you have anything to do with that?
Johnny?
Can you talk to us about what happened in your
I got
house?
it.
Where's Bert Montoya?
Dr. Sherman, can you hear you for most of us?